Welcome to Laos. The small countries in Southeast Asia being bordered by Vietnam to the east, China to the north, Burma to the northwest, Thailand to the west, and Cambodia to the south. And all of its neighbors are stronger than it, having the influential power of Bolivia and Paraguay. Nothing wrong with those countries, but come on! With a population of about 7.7 million and a GDP of 15 billion, it's the second poorest country in ASEAN, only being ahead of Myanmar, and considering Myanmar's situation, it's not that good. And the country being entirely mountainous and covered in forest, making only 3% of the land area arable and 0.7% available year-round. Relying on the Mekong River, being at the will of China's dams, the country is landlocked, relying on Thailand and Vietnam to export its products outside the ASEAN market. Its main export is electricity and some raw resources. Laos is a country that has been influenced by its neighbors and being a buffer state throughout history, being locked in a geographic prison by being blocked from the Tonkin Gulf by the Annamite Mountains and the Mekong River with Thailand, trapping Laos into a corner. This place is unlucky and confusing. Geopolitics didn't treat Laos very well. But before we continue, for the sake of simplicity, I will call the people of Laos Laotian, unless I'm differentiating from ethnic Lao and other ethnicities. So, let's look at the land of a million elephants. Laos has historically been run by multi-ethnic confederative monarchist states. Between river valleys and highlands, it is believed that the Lao migrated from southern China, and the rise of Lan Xang birthed the Lao identity. With Fangum founding the first Lao kingdom, Lan Xang would expand outwards and dominate the northern Mekong Delta and the Isan region of Thailand. Laos would be at its greatest extent around the 16th century. The kingdom would experience turmoil between conflict amongst the princes, and one came on top, and there was peace for about half a century. And then it broke into three pieces, and the Siamese and Vietnamese invaded the kingdom, and it lost half of its territory, which was a massive blow to Lao dominance. And Siam, aka Thailand, would take over the three federal kingdoms which were confederated. Isn't it a nice, peaceful day? I know, right? What the fuck? Donne-moi le Laos. What the hell? No.
Tu sais quoi? Je pense que je vais juste te menacer passivement et agressivement avec mes canons hors de ta capitale.
Damn you baguette people! Who do these rip-off Italians think they are? Only the first part. Okay, fine. I accept your treaty. After the fiasco between Siam and France, the Sino-Franco Treaty of 1904 was signed. Siam relinquished everything east of the Mekong River and this part of Laos, and would later give up northwest Cambodia and northern Malaya to the British. And the Kingdom of Laos would become a French protectorate. France made Laos a protectorate, officially forming its modern-day borders. France placed European system of government conflicting with the Laotian riverbank system of governance, causing tension. Laos would be integrated into the larger French Indochina Federation centered in Saigon. Laos was split into multiple pieces, but the main entity we have to focus on is the Kingdom of Luang Prabang. Now, Lao had two capitals, Vientiane, Vientiane, whatever, Vientiane. The administrative capital is where all the decisions of the protectorate is made, and Luang Prabang is the royal capital and ceremonial where the king resides. The French no way allowed the king to be a figurehead displaying unity within Laos. He was basically a French puppet. The kingdom was administered by provisional governors and a 4-member council by the viceroy. Skip to 1920, the current king, Bon Kong, died, and now his son, Petsarat, is the king, and he brought in some drastic reforms, like an assembly, regional chiefs, a reorganization of the council and Buddhist administration systems, and building a bureaucracy. A spyglass view of what's happening in East Asia. To put a long story short, Japan beat Russia and took Korea and southern Sakhalin. Now, right place, right time. China just fell into pieces for like the 1 millionth time in history, and Japan takes the opportunity to invade Manchuria and then signs an armistice with the Chinese government. The Marco Polo Bridge incident set the resume of the war, with Japanese forces quickly flashing by the unprepared Chinese, taking over Beijing, Shanghai, and everything was cool until they reached Nanjing. In the meanwhile, the US sanctioned Japan. As a resourceless island, it was forced to expand, and it was eyeing Southeast Asia as it was rich in rubber and oil that Japan desperately needed. So they swept and took over Southeast Asia, and with the Allies preoccupied in Europe, it wasn't a challenge. Now under Japanese rule, Laos had semi-independence, though leaders believed that Laos was too small to be independent, and Siam had its old territories given back to it, and the kingdom of Luang Prabang expanded. Now, the idea of an independent Laos really started to pick up steam, especially among a nationalist group called the Laotians. Back to World War II, Japan struck the USA at Pearl Harbor, which brought the US into World War II. In Europe, Germany was fumbling the bag, and with the new confidence, the liberated France started airdropping agents to recruit local guerrillas to harass the Japanese. And a year later, the US decided to humble Japan with a fat man and a little boy on August 6, 1945, and Japan surrendered. Chinese forces were assigned to retreat the already departed Japanese forces, but they were more interested in doing opium instead. Laos was returned to French hands, but the decolonization trains in Africa and Asia were not going to stop anytime soon. The King of Laos reinforced the French protectorate, so with World War II over, in a couple of years, Laos gets its independence and we all live happily ever after, right? Until now, I haven't mentioned neighboring Vietnam, which will be essential to knowing the following events. In World War II, the Viet Minh rose up, winning the hearts of the populace. Due to a famine caused by Japanese occupation and Allied bombings, after World War II, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the ICP, proclaims the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. On September 2nd, negotiations between the Viet Minh and France failed, and Ho Chi Minh takes up arms against the French. France loses the First Indochina War and is forced to leave Indochina, giving way to 4 independent countries, and Laos is one of them, gaining independence in 1950, but France would recognize it on October 22nd of 1953. Now you might be wondering, why I didn't mention Laos? And it's because most of the fighting was happening in Vietnam and just a whole lot of nothing in these jungly mountains on the border. Just yet. Laos gained independence as a kingdom with the Laotian royal family being deeply unpopular amongst the people, which would fuel into a civil war. From now on, Laos will be in non-stop chaos for almost 2 decades. With different political factions being unable to make a unified government, the Lao is already dissolved and the communist Pathet Lao would take its place. In this game of the Cold War, Indochina was the new hotspot for the US and USSR to do a massive dick measuring contest. And coincidentally, Indochina lit up in a region-wide war, with communist Vietnam and capitalist South Vietnam going to war with each other. To sleep in the south, the Viet Minh invaded Laos and the Pathet Lao took the opportunity to take power, which started the Laotian Civil War, aka Royalists versus Communists. The Pathet Lao originally started as a nationalist movement, but its reliance on Vietnam eventually turned it communist. By Laos's independence, it had already controlled the eastern parts of the country, with North Vietnam using Laos for the Ho Chi Minh Trail to infiltrate South Vietnam. The royal government was furious by the Pathet Lao's actions. The US gave the royal government aid and covered 80% of the government's expenses and all of its military and security needs to prevent the spread of communists. But most of the imports and aid were either met with corruption, embezzlement, or put in the black market to be sold for profit. Communist forces attempted an attack on Luang Prabang, which was thwarted by monsoons. The royalists started to equip Hmong fighters, enabling them to fight besides them. The royalists and the communists agreed to hold an election that ended in a 55-45 result, and no government with a clear majority was able to be formed. The US got aid to Laos to force a devaluation of the Laotian kip, which was overpriced. In response, Laos approved a right-wing government, which made the Pathet Lao furious, with tensions rising a year later. Pathet Lao and North Vietnam invaded Laos again. North Vietnam sent 40,000 men to assist the Pathet Lao, and the US started a full-on bombing campaign, making Laos the most bombed country on earth. Still to this day, with 260 million bombs dropped on Laos, that's about a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes. Despite the bombings, it failed to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the royalist side had a massive weakness, and that was with the US intelligence. The US Secretary of State supported the king, but the CIA supported the prime minister and the planned coup. For the most part, tension in the country was frozen, with a few skirmishes here and there. With the US and Vietnam funding their respective client armies, communist forces continued pushing, eventually taking over the Plain of Jars, which is full of thousands of ancient big stone jars. The US would assist Hmong fighters to airdrop at Nam Bak, which was soon surrounded and destroyed. About only a third of the 3,000 soldiers returned, and it permanently crippled the RLA, withdrawing from the Muang Sai and Sian Koang, with Long Tieng being contested. The communist forces would focus on the south, capturing Sekong and Atapeo. The US started an offensive to Zipan, but due to Congress budget cuts, no air support was able to fly, and the South Vietnamese completely retreated from the country after losing a third of its men. The Pathet Lao would capture the Teng, Laong Gam, Pak Se, and the whole Bulaven Plateau. It's 1973, and the parties have just signed the Paris Accords, which Laos was not included in. In the treaty, the US would pull out of Laos and South Vietnam completely. The Prime Minister of Laos suffered a heart attack and decided that it would be best for the country if he stepped down. With the anti-communist coalition being leaderless, it soon got mired in instability and deep corruption. With America stopping aid to Laos, the RLA was forced to cut down on military cost, making the military weak and the Pathet Lao, funded by North Vietnam, becoming stronger and stronger. The Pathet Lao promised the rest of the political groups free elections, democratic rights, freedom of religion, and constructive economic policies. At the next moment, they restrict opposition speech in the parts of the countries they control. I mean, come on, what did you expect from a communist? The Pathet Lao would steamroll through the country at the collapse of the RLA. On December 2nd, the Pathet Lao captured Vientiane. The king and prime minister agreed to resign, and the Lao People's Democratic Republic was proclaimed, with Suphanavong as its president. 30% of the Hmong population, who were mainly on the royalist side, fled the country to mainly the US, which has the largest Hmong population outside of Asia, and the government would commit a genocide against them, and over 100,000 people died during the Civil War. The communist government turned back on its promises of elections and free speech, and all non-communist newspapers were banned, and started a purge of civil, army, and police services. The Pathet Lao cut ties to every country on earth, with the exception of the newly reunified Vietnam. Thailand essentially embargoed Laos, though those restrictions would be lifted a decade later. Laos ended up with 78 million unexploded bombs, being given the title of the most bombed country on earth, with about 86 bombs dropped per person. Intellectuals who were willing to work for the new government left, and about 10% of the whole population fled the country to Thailand. 90% of educated Laotians left as well. So what did the government do? They planned on developing socialism without going through the process of capitalism. You know, all the workers rising up kinda gig. But there was one eensy-weensy problem. 90% of Laotians worked in subsistence agriculture, and Laos pretty much had no industry to speak of. Agricultural collectivism was enforced, making all land state-owned, and everybody had to give a share of their crops to the government. And many farmers were content with the program, and with the difficulty of patrolling the long Lao-Thai border, just sold their crops to the free Thai market instead. In 1979, Vietnam invades Cambodia, subsequently leading to the Sino-Vietnamese War. With pressure from Vietnam, Laos cut all ties to China, losing an important receiver of aid and trade. Being totally reliant on Vietnam, imports practically disappeared. A military coup in Thailand happened, with the military government plotting an assassination against the Laotian president Khai Son, and Laos's economy started to tank. A large number of educated people were emigrating every year. With no skilled people, the education system completely collapsed, Allied technicians had no interest in developing the country other than extracting resources from it. And with a Vietnamese-led anti-China political environment and the Thai embargo, Laos didn't have enough money to keep the lights on. Now, Laos is completely broke. With two of its neighbors hating it and supporting insurgencies, Laos signed a 25-year friendship treaty with Vietnam and 30,000 Vietnamese troops to station in the country, practically making Laos a puppet state. Hatred for the government was at an all-time high. With a desperate call from the USSR, President Isan pulled back the socialist program and gave into capitalist economics. Skip a decade, in 1986, Laotian and Chinese relations started to warm up, and Laos's dependence on Vietnam diminished. With Vietnam removing most of its troops from the country, it made its first steps to improving relations with the US and started getting aid and investment. All was going well until... The USSR collapsed, bringing an end to Laos's largest aid donor, renewing an economic crisis for an economy that's already in the garbage. Laos had no choice but to ask France, Japan, the World Bank, and Asian Development Bank for aid, and in the terms of this aid, Laos was practically thrown into the pool of globalism. Thailand meanwhile returned to a civilian government, which lifted the embargo and helped the Laotian economy, which only had a size of $1.2 billion in 1998. Isan, the long-term president of Laos, and Khamtai would become the president and chairman of the LPRP. Laos's economy started to recover. There was no sign of political development with the LPRP having a monopoly over the whole country. There were bomb attacks and sprinkles of insurgencies. In 2009, the US lifted all sanctions and restrictions, which allowed greater growth in Laos, with foreign investment at the expense of minorities and local farmers. Though Laos's economy started to grow for the first time in ever, with a growth rate of about 7% every year since the start of the millennium. What about the abysmal infrastructure? Roads made about 98% of all transportation in the country, and only 17% of those roads were paved. Now, being a least developed country, like neighboring Myanmar and Cambodia, the Laotian government in 2015 set up a plan to turn Laos from a landlocked country to a land-linked country. In 2009, Laos and China started the construction of a railway connecting Vientiane to Botan, which is a smaller development in the Pan-Asian Railway project connecting Singapore to Kunming. A couple of corruption charges, MOUs, and handshakes later, the $6 billion railway was built, with it being nearly half of the country's total GDP, and also a new dry port financed by Thailand, building new hydroelectric projects to make Laos the battery of Southeast Asia. But officials worry with this one-sided relationship, Laos might end up being China's battery that is owned, used, and benefits China. Laos's debt to GDP has doubled in under a decade since 2015. Laos remains to be one of the least free countries for political rights and press freedom in the world. Though the country has a bright future, its future events we can only tell.